Hello, mate, and welcome back to Let's Code Season 6. We're getting close to the end of the season now, and we've added so much cool functionality that it's about time that we started patting ourselves on the back, to be quite honest. But there are still a few little things that I want to improve, and a couple of things that I still want to add. So don't panic. This is not the last episode, but we're getting close. That's all I'm saying. So let's jump straight into the first thing that I want to change before we do anything else. So this function is going to go in the room class. And what this function does is it checks whether a position is within the bounds of the matrix. Several of our other methods within the room class do this. And rather than having that code repeated over and over again in several methods, it makes more sense to have one method that does it. And then in every place where we need to check whether an item is within the bounds of the matrix, we just call this method instead. So this is what coding is all about, is making reusable code that we can repeatedly use over and over again rather than constantly having to retype it. I know that you're probably thinking, well, I've already retyped it over and over again, so why would I do that now? But there's going to be tweaks that you want to make as you continue to develop this game at the end of the series. And having these functions that do these jobs for you just makes a lot more sense, and it'll save you a lot of time. And it also reduces the margin for error because you think, well, if I keep retyping this over and over again, I'm bound to make a typo sooner or later. So if you only have it typed once, then the chances are you're probably going to not have those issues as often. So within bounds, and then we take in the position as a parameter, and then all it does is it returns true or false depending on whether the statement in the brackets is true. So if 0 is less than position 1, which is less than the length of the matrix, and 0 is less than position 0, which is less than the x-coordinate of the matrix. If all of those conditions are true, then it will return true. Otherwise, it will return false, and that's how that's going to work. Okay, so now we've defined another screen called dialog, and it takes a parameter this time. You can do this with screens. You can have a parameter passed in so that when you call it, it has a variable to use. And we've also given it a style prefix called dialog, which is where the bit of code at the bottom comes in, but we'll talk about that in a sec. And all this screen does is it puts a text message on the screen. It's a frame with no background. It shows text as a message, and then it has a timer on it that lasts for 5 seconds, and after 5 seconds, the screen will hide itself. Now, the text message line, you'll notice it doesn't have any styling parameters attached to it, and that's because we've actually created a style called dialog text down here in the bottom, which dictates that the text is going to be size 24, color is going to be white, the alignment of the text is going to be dead center. This outlines statement is actually going to add a drop shadow to our text, and then the font is a font that I found online and I've downloaded and I've put into a folder called fonts within my GUI folder. So you can download any font that you want really and just use that. I'm obviously not licensed to be able to distribute other people's fonts, so you'll have to just find one yourself and download it and put it in the fonts folder, and then you can name that in here. I prefer using TTF files. I believe Ren'Py can use different types of files as well, but that's the font that I've gone for. So yeah, this outlines line is the important one in terms of styling because it's the one that's going to give us the drop shadow on our text and make it look all nice. Okay. So what we have here is a new class that goes in our entity file because it inherits from the entity class. And I've called it NPC, but you can call it whatever you want, really. There's no rule that says you have to call it NPC. And it takes in the parameters of a name, an icon, and a prefix. And we'll talk about what the prefix is about in a moment. But all it does is takes in those three parameters, and then it will call the superclass, the parent class, in this case, the entity class's constructor, and it will pass the name and the icon in, as well as true, false, true, false. And true, false is reference to whether the item, whether it's aggressive, whether it can be used, whether it can be moved, and whether it can be alive. So in this case, it is alive and it is usable. You can interact with it, but it's not movable and it's not aggressive. Now we've got prefix and stage. And these are, for those of you who completed other Let's Code seasons, might recognize the stage word. And this is basically a way of, if we wanted this NPC to have multiple lines of dialogue, what we can do is when we interact with the NPC in this case, it will call from a list the dialogue that it wants to say this time around, and then it will append the stage number, and then it will call the next item in the list, and so on. So that's all that is. And you'll notice that get prefix and get stage are our getters. In this point, you already know how to use getters and what they're for, so I don't really need to explain those lines here. And then because we've got abstract methods in the parent class, update, move, and interact, we have to have all three of them in this class. Even though we're not using the update and move methods, we've still got to have something there. So we've just got pass in both of those. Now, this is an NPC because that's just the name I've chosen for it, but you could, more accurately, this is probably more something like a signpost or some kind of note on the ground or something like that, because when we interact with it, all it does is it shows a message on the screen using the dialog screen that we just created. But as I said, we can have the messages changing if you want to, just by using the stage parameter and incrementing that each time we interact with it, so that it shows a different message every time we interact with it. Or you could have a loop that's maybe 5 messages that you interact with it, and it just loops through 5 messages or picks a random one. The choice is yours. You already have the skills to do that at this point, so you can carry on. The ideas, the numbers of things that you can do with this are fairly limitless, to be honest. You could even have a proper quest system where this NPC tells you to go somewhere else and you have to go there and then you come back. But again, those are all outside the scope of this particular series. But if you've been paying attention, you probably already developed skills to do that off your own back. So the interact method, as always, takes in the player as a parameter, and then all we do is we show on the screen dialogue. The message is this person doesn't wish to speak to me right now. And we'll see that in action at the end of the video when I demonstrate this code all working. But ultimately, that's all this is going to do. This is just going, it's an object on the screen that when we interact with it, it displays a message rather than picking it up or anything like that. Okay, so we're using our entity class for things other than moving characters. We're using it for things in the landscape that we can interact with, like our treasure chest in the previous episode. We could even have things like rocks that we can destroy if we have a certain thing within our inventory. So, if you wanted to make it all Minecrafty, you could say there's a pickaxe object that if it's in your inventory, this object would just destroy. You'd be able to chop down trees and cut rocks with certain tools and things like that. So, as I said, the options here are limitless, really. So I want to be able to add entities to our room prefab so that we don't have to manually declare where they're all going to be. It's not going to work for every entity. For example, things like treasure chests that require us to provide a list or an instance for the thing that's going to be contained within them. We're going to have to manually declare those for the time being, but we can still do that with some of the entities that just have predefined classes. So we're going to add to our prefab class in a bit. But what I want to do first is I want to actually add the room prefab as a property within our room class rather than just having it as a reference passed. And that's just because we're now referencing the room prefab so many times throughout the code of the room class that we might as well just store it as a variable within the room class and then just reference it directly. So as you can see, we've made some changes to the room classes constructor up here, and we're also going to make some changes to other parts of the class as well. In particular, the setup method, which you can see I've actually split. So now, rather than having the loop where it goes through everything in the list of things in the prefab and then creates instances of them within the room, because we're now checking for item game objects and entities, we have 2 separate lists, one for items and one for entities. So we actually need to loop through this list twice. So again, just like we did earlier on in this video, we've created a method that accepts the list and the position list as parameters, and then it'll loop through the list and the parameter list, or the position list, sorry, and create temporary instances within the room like that. And then all we have to do in the setup method is just pass the list and the positions list that we want. So the first time we call it, we pass the items list and the item positions list. The second time we call the method, we pass in entity and get entity list. So that's basically all that's happening here. It just looks more complicated. So what we need to do now is we actually need to make some adjustments to the prefab. So here we go. Here's our prefab constructor. And as you can see, we've added two new parameters, entities and entity positions within the parentheses, and then they are passed into actual variables from the class. So self underscore entities equals entities, and self underscore entity positions is equal to entity positions. And of course, we're going to need getters for those two new fields. So here they are for those of you who still need a reminder on how to write getters, but that's what they look like basically. So we also need to add some code to the bottom in the function that passes in the XML. So we're going to copy the loop that passes in the items, the game objects list, and we're going to basically just completely replicate the same code, but this time we're going to do it for a list of entities and entity positions. So we actually need to add a line of code that says find all and then entity. And then when we actually create the prefab into the prefabs list, obviously we need to remember to add in the new entities property and the entities positions property at the end of the line there, otherwise the code won't work and it'll crash. Okay, so we're just going to go through the list, check for any entities, and then when we've got a list of entities, we're just going to get the name and the position X and Y and turn those into an actual position, just like we did with the items. Okay, so it's literally just replicate the code that we wrote for creating the game objects in our prefab, and do the same thing for any entities that we've added to the code. And then here is a new XML file with an entity in it. So as you can see, we've got a new test room, which is a test room that's 20 by 15 in size. It's got one health potion small in it and a shield of blocking in it. And then it's also got a chest key in it, which is an item. And then we've got two entities. We've got one called Goblin 1 and one called Barry. Goblin 1 is an enemy from the enemy class, and Barry is an NPC from the NPC class. So they're going to do different things because they're obviously different subclasses of the entity parent class, and they have slightly different behaviors, but they will both be spawned in to the room when we create it and we have a look at it. So here we go, we're inside the game. I've got all this stuff spawned in the room as predicted. I can just nip up and grab the shield of blocking and this potion. I'm going to just dash down here and grab the key as well. And then I'm going to go and have a look at this goblin. And we'll see what happens if I get it to attack. Because I've got the shield of blocking, it's doing 0 damage to me. If I drop the shield of, try again, if I drop the shield of blocking and come back down, now it's taking 10 hit points off me. Go and pick it up again. It's doing 0 damage to me again. And then if I talk to the NPC, I get this message pop up on the screen. And after 5 seconds, it disappears. So that's basically it for this episode, guys. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I do appreciate the feedback. I will see you in the next episode, but until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, all right? Bye-bye.